Good afternoon. That's the introduction that I get. No other further introduction needed. We'll let people trickle in, and I'll get started. My name is Chris Brown. I'm a manager with REMI. If those of you that have been with CCL and been familiar with this study, you'll notice immediately I am not. Scott Nystrom, who was the primary author of this work and who has talked at these conferences previously and was the sort of leader behind this original analysis. And so the only thing I can assure you is there will be far fewer references to Iowa State. It's the only thing I can assure you. So today we're going to revisit one of the studies, or the study that we did, and again, Scott led, related to, as we spell out, the economic, fiscal, demographic, and some climate-related impacts of CCL's sort of primary proposal. It's fairly comprehensive work that I'll try to get through the methodology, the results, and leave quite a bit of time at the end for some Q&A. Before I get into it, actually, I'm just curious. This is, again, the third year that this study has been out, and my first opportunity to talk in front of CCL members. Actually, so I'm really excited to hear. Scott's told me about some of your enthusiasm, and just walking through the halls, I feel quite a bit of energy. So it is exciting, and I'm curious to know who here knows more about the study than I do. We'll find out. I'm guessing there's a few of you. But just as a show of hands, who here has, I would say, attended briefings or would consider yourself fairly well versed in this analysis? Few hands. Okay. I guess I'll. So the rest of you, I guess, would the rest of you put yourself? Who has? I guess I'll ask then. Is this the first time viewing this study, the results, or would consider yourself very new to the subject? Okay, good. Okay, and then some of you are somewhere in between, or you're lying. Okay, well, like I said, what I'll try to do is walk you through the analysis, the methodology, the findings, some of the talking points, but really this has been a study that's been used quite a bit by CCL's members, specifically through individual meetings that you have, as I understand, and we've attended, or Scott has attended, did attend 4 briefings, and Capitol Hill, 2 on the Senate side and 2 on the House side. As I understand, there was about 70 plus staff that attended. Each of those very well received, and large audiences of staff. 2 particular briefings were related to the entirety of the study when this was released, and then there was 2 that emphasized the regions that were hardest hit, and then the regions that benefited the most, so sort of attacked the strengths and weaknesses of the analysis. I guess I've talked a little about Scott, and as an author with REMI, and I'm clear is no longer with REMI, but continues to use our tools and be part of our work and our world. The study was also done in partnership with Synapse Energy, a group out of Massachusetts, and there was also quite a few contributors and folks that helped edit and contribute to the scope and the findings and the methodology. I believe this started as I may get the timeline incorrect, or some of the parts incorrect, but this started as some work that we did for a group in Massachusetts focusing on a state-level carbon tax that predated this study. And following that, we did some work in Washington State, Oregon, and California. All these reports are out there, and then we did the national study. And since this has been released, I believe there may have been 1 or 2 other states that have done some state-level economic analysis. Just recently, a group that is actually represented here, just released a study called Center for Climate Strategies, another CCS, completed some work here in the district on a carbon tax, potentially going through the legislature here in the district using our tool. So just give you a sense of some of the organizations and regions that have implemented this. I want to point this out, there's a good audience here. I know there's a lot of other folks that continue to ask questions. We use Danny as the primary point of contact that can facilitate a lot of your questions. Following this discussion, I do want to encourage, we'll try to tally your questions. I want to encourage further questions following this. We want this to continue to be a document and a study that you use. So please feel free to reach out to Danny Richter. I didn't include his email. I'm assuming all of you have him on speed dial. If you don't, you can tell him I said you can. Not to give him any more work, but he's very knowledgeable about the study, can answer a lot of questions, but anything that he can't, or if there's anything that we can sort of continue to do, support, we try to go through Danny. So just a little bit more about us. We are an economic modeling firm, so we specialize in development of tools, simulation models that are used to look at a wide range of policy issues, public policy issues, ranging from infrastructure questions, economic development, fiscal policy, healthcare related policy. And so early on, we're sought out as a group that could help take this issue and apply the sort of state-of-the-art tools. And I think it's really a testament to CCL's sort of early commitment to doing this the right way, sort of the early framework for the study that was developed by Scott and some of the partners, that this study and this analysis still has usefulness, still has application. There's some ways in which we may suggest could be updated, could be revised, could further inform you as members. But some of the organizations that we work with at the state level, that's again outside, just to give you a sense of our scope. So we are a nonpartisan organization that work with groups like here in DC, work with, say, the National Education Association. We work with National Federation of Independent Business, American Gas Association. At the state level, we work with groups, say, like Texas Legislative Budget Board, along with California Department of Finance, or the Nebraska Legislature and Department of Revenue. So there's a good representation of use of REMI models within states as well. So it lends, I'm advocating for us, but sort of lends some credibility when you talk to members, when you talk to folks within your regions, within your states. They may be familiar with our tools and our models from other applications. Okay, so let's go through just the basics, the overview, and some of the results. The way that this was put together, largely for the purpose of modeling, and I don't know the exact rationale originally, but the analysis is based upon a policy design that starts at $10 per year, starts at $10 per metric ton in 2016, and escalates at $10 per year through the forecast. So we developed a projection of the impact of this particular fee and dividend structures through 2035, which was kind of the scope of the tools that we use, and I'll get into the specifics of the model. It included a border adjustment, so essentially applying the tax onto imports of goods and services that were coming into the United States based upon the energy contents or that resembled what produced here in the States, so that we did not necessarily incentivize any competitive advantage to move imports outside the U.S. And all funds were returned via monthly checks through fee and dividend structures. I don't think I need to educate you on the design of what we have. The results, and this study was, again, very broad in what it was able to provide and present across sort of the macro level, including sort of economic results. So we looked at jobs and GDP, economic growth. I looked at income, prices of various commodities by region, by sector. So we included some basic analysis to try to understand how this would actually impact the overall emissions through reduction of CO2, some particulates, NOx and SOx, and estimate essentially savings in these categories against a base case. Included a fiscal estimate, so a revenue estimate for the collection that then provided some insight into the size of the dividend check, monthly dividend check. It looked at energy and the impact on downstream consumers of higher energy prices, and then looked at some of the demographics and shifting within the United States based upon where we might see job growth or higher prices, lower prices. So we shift in the demographics as well. So just give you a sense of the type of results, very comprehensive in the scope. Let's get into it. Okay, so this analysis, this original analysis, broke down the U.S. into 9 regions. These are defined by census, the U.S. 9 census regions, including Pacific, out west, the mountain region, west north central here, spanning the plains, a west south central, including a lot of the energy resource rich, and you can see, I guess, the other regions, how they're split up and where your states might be involved. And so the reason we split this up into 9 regions was to provide some perspective, not just at a national level, but recognize that there is a very distinct industry base within different parts of the country, a distinct sort of energy use, mix of energy use, and sort of distinct demographics. And so by applying the tax, applying the fee, and representing that at a sub-national level across these regions, we get, as we'll get into the results, very interesting results that are not necessarily one-size-fits-all for the U.S. Now, REMI can develop, as I mentioned, some of the states can develop models down to the individual state level and represent some of these changes. To this point, that has not been done. So, as I said, we are an economic modeling firm. We develop a tool, in this case, called PI+, and that might be one of the models used by some of these other organizations throughout the country. But we had to find a way to represent the change specifically within the energy market. So essentially, the scope of the study is to represent how this tax will flow through the economy, and then separately account for how higher dividend payments or the dividend payment will flow through the economy, and what will the net effect be. So we had to come up with a couple different tools that could represent exactly how that would look. Our partners at Synapse ran a model called REEDS, developed by the National Renewable Energy Lab, by NREL. They maintain and update and ran REEDS, which essentially gives us the ability to look at the decisions in terms of power generation in the electricity market based upon what this tax means for the, again, power market. So it allowed, in some of these other states and other regions, we've used a tool that did not allow for the switching of power. As you saw, increase in prices, we were able to, through REEDS, estimate sort of when investments were made, what generation would occur based upon what was most economically sort of efficient and lowest cost given the escalating carbon price. So that fed us electricity costs, and it fed us investment decisions, basically decommissioning and ultimately the creation of the sort of faster growth of some of the alternative lower carbon content electricity producing facilities. So that was within REEDS. The CAT model, the carbon assessment tool, I think is maybe what it breaks down to, was a model we repurposed from a tool called, I I think actually I may get into this in the coming slide. So let me see if I left anything out on reads. Developed by NREL, ran by Synapse, again, looking at the long-term investment decisions and essentially generation, what the capacity is going forward, accounting for things that, and like ultimately the reliability, and is it possible to really, given the sort of intermittency of some of the alternative fuels, what do we actually need to keep online based upon growth of, we can't just necessarily see 100% renewables in most cases. So the CAT model, the carbon analysis tool, was an overhaul of a tool that was created by a gentleman named Kevin Morey from during his time working in Washington State, and that essentially forecasts a base case and an alternative case for fuel consumption by region. So that allows us to apply this tax, this escalating tax, that then generates the revenue estimate. So it gives us a base case for consumption from the NIMS modeling system or from the Department of Energy, American Energy Outlook, and then allows us to, again, apply a tax to generate an alternative accounting for price elasticity of demand, or essentially some behavioral shift based upon a reduction. You raise the price, people shift demand and lower consumption. So there's a demand response built into the CAT tool as well that then give us, so it doesn't incorporate the switching, that's from reads, but then it also includes the emissions forecasts that provide us some variables that feed into REMI for the amenities. So I apologize, you can't really see this slide at all, I imagine, but this represents the way that the PI Plus model, or REMI's PI Plus model, is set up. It's a 5-block structure. So not necessarily here to educate you on the way that REMI is set up, but ultimately we were able to represent the policy change into distinct parts of the macroeconomy in multiple parts. So the idea is that this policy is simultaneously hitting energy costs, and through the income dividend payment is going back to households and consumers, right, representing in different parts of the economy. So within the software, there are, I don't know exactly how many, but dozens, if not hundreds, of variables that ultimately go into the simulation model that represent all of these particular changes and how energy prices get passed on to businesses, to individuals, and how that money is refunded back to households. Okay? So, to the results. At a national level, we see positive impacts on employment to the tune of, by 2025, just over 2 million jobs against the baseline. So the way that we interpret this, and the way that when you go out and speak about the results and the nature of the study and the nature of the results, everything is against a baseline, against what REMI would assume to be the standard baseline. So we're looking at this change and the structure of this policy change in isolation against what would have been without this particular policy. So you can reference this and say there would be an additional 2.2 or 2.3 million jobs by 2025 absent this particular policy change. So these are in, it's probably not labeled, so this is in thousands. So 2,000 thousands is how you would interpret this graph. So I'm pointing this number out here, somewhere around 2.2, 2.3. And the numbers, again, the full report, and I didn't mention this in the opening, but CCL has developed several documents around this study. There's a national 4-page summary, I believe. There's a short video. There's some associated information at the regional level. So if you want to break this out and look at your region in a lot more detail, hello, am I back? I'm back. Okay, I think all right. you look puzzled, I guess it's because you can't hear me. You're not that I'm saying the wrong thing. That's good. Okay, so this is interesting, and this was, I think, when the original analysis was done in some of the states, was, led to a lot of questions. And as you might imagine, there's a sort of an understanding or a way of thinking that exists with a lot of policymakers and individuals that ultimately, environmental-based policy, or in this case, fiscal policy, tax policy, be it for sort of environmental end, is pitted against the economy. So it's either environmental protection or environmental growth or economic growth. And that is the sort of message that I think precipitated the early development of this type of study. And when you look at the results, they sort of flip that on their head. And there's numerous examples of work done not by REMI, but by other clients and other organizations that have found similar type of findings. And the reason is when you get into some of the details, when you get into some of the mechanisms that are going on within the economy that ultimately make this a far more intuitive result and finding. So on one hand, we can break this down regionally. So this is the employment impacts on across the 9 regions. So for the most part, every region of the country sees positive job growth against the baseline, except for the West, South, Central. So this is the region of the country, again, that includes Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas. And so this begins to start to paint the picture of some of those regional differences in the underlying industry base within these economies that would not ultimately lend itself to the same type of, that because of the industry base in terms of refining, mining, large exports of fossil fuels, that ultimately does not see the same benefits, or does the benefits related to the higher dividend payment does not offset the negative effects related to the tax. This is South Atlantic. So we have New England, Mid-Atlantic, East, North, Central. So I don't have the in front of me, but we can, now that you guys are on board thinking about regions, maybe you can revisit this and look at the regions again. So here is the SA, South Atlantic. This is your East, South, Central region, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee. Then you have Kentucky. You have your East, North, Central, your Great Lakes, West, North, Central, and Plains, I guess you might call it the Plains region, Mountain and Pacific, New England, and then Mid-Atlantic, which captures Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. Okay, so a little more reference there. Yep, absolutely. So that's again the employment base at a regional level, and then we can explain this now when we break this down ultimately to an employment level. So on the employment side, we can look on a sector by sector basis and get a sense of the, again, distribution of the employment effects. The largest positive effects are seen in ultimately what are consumer facing, or those industries that benefit most from the dividend payments, or an increase in consumption. Essentially, this money is going back directly to households, and the largest portion, and the industries, the sectors that benefit the most ultimately are healthcare, retail, accommodation, construction. The sectors that lose the most employment are mining, utilities, you may notice that manufacturing is right here, that's slightly positive in terms of employment. So on one hand, there's the trade-off between what industries essentially are hurt the most based upon the energy prices that reduce demand and the shift in the technology that's used to produce power ultimately does affect, again, the mining, the extraction-based industries. Within manufacturing, it's largely the refining, petroleum product manufacturing. But there's also a shift in the industries based upon their productivity or their labor sort of intensity. So resource-based jobs may contribute significant amounts to GDP, but are not necessarily don't necessarily employ the most amount of people. And I think Scott used to talk about this, so I'll quote Scott here, and I don't know if it's an exact number, but the supply chain and the jobs that are directly related to resource extraction, energy mining is somewhere, you could say, around 2 million jobs, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, say around 2 million jobs for the entire country. So that's coal mining, again, that's everything that you might put in the bucket of resource extraction, refining, is about 2 million jobs. Now construction, healthcare, retail, all have around 20 million jobs in each of those sectors. Now it's not entirely, healthcare I think is maybe a little over 20, construction maybe a little bit lower, but you can see that these energy industries are very capital intensive and don't necessarily employ a lot of people. So the jobs, it makes sense that the jobs would be marginally positive when you shift this income towards consumption that's going to products and services that are very labor, that require a lot of jobs. So now shifting to GDP, or to measurement of economic activity. So this is the contribution of industry value. So this is sales of industries, and you subtract their cost of doing business, their intermediates, gives you GDP, or value added. And we can see positive growth in GDP, and in each year, even in the out years, as we do see slight decline relative to a baseline, the growth is not as positive. So at no point do we see GDP dipping below or growing less than it would have. But as a percent, and I should have maybe put percents in, but employment is around, I believe the national average is around 2%. GDP in terms of 80 billion in terms of relative to our entire U.S. economy is a very small percent. So now we look at the GDP effects regionally, and certainly are a little bit less smaller as a percent of each industry's potential growth. And in each year, the West-South Central is actually negative. So you noticed in the jobs effect, it saw a slight positive impact in the initial years before it did dip below baseline slightly. However, from a GDP standpoint, it's negative in each year. And that goes back to the idea that these energy-related companies, the firms that are based in that area of the country, produce a lot of value in terms of economic value added. And so when you transition to service-based, consumer-based jobs, you get maybe more employment, but you don't have as much GDP growth. But I will point out that, again, $70 billion at its peak, or somewhere around $30 billion relative to the region's projected GDP in that time frame, I think is somewhere around just over 1% relative to a baseline. So again, the way I want to make very clear that the way you interpret this is at no point, even in the West-South Central, are we suggesting that there is negative growth. So we are not sending any part of the country into recession. We are simply suggesting that some parts of the country might grow, particular West-South Central would grow slower, slightly slower than it would have otherwise. Okay? To the same tune on the positive effects is, and you can do the same when you look at regionally or on an industry basis. So this is the value added on an industry by industry basis. So we see other sectors in terms of including utilities, transportation, mining, relative to a baseline. This is the annual average going from 2016 through 2035 below a baseline. Manufacturing is at the bottom. And as I alluded to previously, when you break down manufacturing into its component, some of the component types of manufacturing, including motor vehicles, food at the top, you can see down at the bottom those sectors that are most hit is petroleum and coal product manufacturing, that essentially the refining component of manufacturing. But industries that are, again, are related to consumer-facing are either not affected very much or have a slight positive impact. So in areas of the country where you see high manufacturing, you might suggest, you may think that this is anti-manufacturing, or people may think this is anti-industry based, but in reality, you see positive job growth and a lot of high value added manufacturing is very marginally affected. It's really just the petroleum, coal, and some of the chemical manufacturing that has hit the most. Related to the emissions, carbon emissions, the projection under the alternative within the CAT model, I believe by 2025 was about 69% of 1990 levels by 2025 and 50% of 1990 levels by 2035. So that's the reduction in CO2 emissions as a result of this shift in energy production and generation to lower carbon content fuels. So I won't get into some of this. So the potential revenue, so this is the projected revenue from the fee and dividend. You can see again by 2025, somewhere around $400 billion. So this is a significant amount of money. I think 2015, the actual collection, you can put this relative to one of the large federal revenue sources is a corporate profit tax. I believe in 2015, the revenue for the entire corporate profit tax was around $350 billion. So this is a significant amount of money in just a short period of time that this particular tax industry can generate. The monthly dividend that is going out to households, so the formula is essentially paid out on a individual basis, and children are given sort of a half point up to 2. So a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children would get 3, would essentially be counted as 3, and then proportionally. So this is, again, just a summary of how this would work out to a family of 4, essentially 3 points. You can see how this would escalate, again, on a monthly basis. We had a quick question, a couple? Oh, go ahead. Yep. Yeah. Sure. The overall revenue. So under our scenario, through this scenario that was developed, including what was known sort of related to energy prices and technology at the time of the study, this did see robust revenue. So it saw continued escalated revenue. So as the tax rate goes up, the reduction in demand, the shift of power, still generated positive revenue. So it's a mechanism of the increasing tax. So the rate is continuing to go up at the same time you're seeing, and again, it may be the case that if technology takes off, although the Reeds model did assume a lot of companies and major investors make decisions very early on because they know they expect this price in the future, it sort of gives them the idea. So it did actually spur further investment, but I think it's mostly driven by it. It doesn't grow at the same rate as the escalation in the tax rate. We can put those two together, and you can see the tax rate is growing faster than the amount of revenues, but it's still positive. It's still generating increase. So it's assuming that it incorporates current projections for energy consumption by fuel type. So that's across electricity, and so that covers mostly coal, natural gas, and some renewables, transportation fuels, and then other fuel consumption as well. But those are the lion's share. And so on the transportation side, it does not assume any escalation in acceptance of low emission. It just has a base case, so it doesn't say that this necessarily ramps up technology and fuel efficiency on the transportation side, again, beyond the current base case. But on the electricity side, it does shift, and I will get to that in a coming slide, what the energy content, energy generation, and capacity looks like. I'll get to that, so it might answer your question. Just a couple more things, and I do want to open this up to questions. I do want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A. So the model, the tools are passing on, for the most part, passing on these energy costs, the tax to consumers through higher energy prices. So overall, we do see an increase in the relative cost of living flatten out somewhere around above 2% or right around 2% within that 10-year window. And the way this, you can explain this is, again, 2% higher relative to what that the annual increase would have been. So the fact that it flattens out around 2%, I believe the way it was calculated, I think this is in the report, essentially says you get one additional year of inflation. Adds one additional year of inflation by the time it flattens around by 2025. So it's not like we're seeing an additional 2% each year. It's just relative to that baseline. So the growth rate is not growing now at 4% instead of 2%. It's just 2% higher than where it would have been. So we see increase in fuel prices on oil products to the tune of somewhere between 10 growing to 50%. Motor gasoline increasing from 10% up to about 45%. On the electricity side, we can see in the near term electricity prices spiking, but over the long term, as you have more renewable, over the long term, those prices actually come down as investments are paid off and there's a switch in electricity production. Natural gas prices are higher as well. However, real income, so this is the real income accounting for those higher prices, is still positive. So this is an annual dollar amount. This is in 2012 dollars. So this is an annual increase in real income per capita on an annual basis above the baseline. So with the dividend payment accounting for the higher prices that are essentially eroding your purchasing power, we still see an increase in real income. Again, this is nationally. To your question about the power sector and to what extent we see a shift within the technology that is used to produce power. Now, this is generation. There is separate graphs that talk about the capacity and the capacity that will remain on demand. But this will be what electricity is most competitive on the market. And so below this red is generally your carbon-based fuels. Above is hydro, and this is the base case. This is the alternative, so you can see that there is a massive decline in fossil fuels to the point where I believe coal is essentially phased out within a 10 to 15 year time horizon. I take that back. This is nuclear. So nuclear, we do assume that nuclear becomes very competitive and does take up some of the generation. Again, there are some regulatory burdens to building new capacity, but we assume that some of those are hurdled. Blue is coal. Blue is coal, unscrubbed. Light blue is coal, scrubbed. Then you have nuclear. Then we have gas, carbon capture sequestration. So it remains somewhat competitive longer than coal, scrubbed or unscrubbed capture sequestration. Gas, carbon capture actually does see growth. The technology, the assumptions around that technology actually make up a good portion as well. Hydro remains about flat, but you can see wind here in the green takes up a large portion of the projected alternative case. Now, solar up here remains a very small share. It, I think, nearly doubles in its generation. Again, these are based upon a lot of assumptions around technology prices and what the capacity was, again, based upon the outlook there in the Reed's model. It's possible we've seen, drop in energy prices. We've seen continued growth in the capability, the capacity of the solar market. So that could certainly change. But given what we knew at the time, this was an assessment of where the generation would be shifted towards. Positive benefits to air quality in terms of these are sort of non-market. These are quantified. Putting a dollar value is essentially the social cost of air quality benefit. This is including NOx and SOx. This is the number of annual reduction in premature deaths related to reduction in CO2, and then applying $6.2 billion is equal to one saved premature death. It's an accounting measure that was used throughout the federal government, largely by the Department of Transportation, and uses some of our other models. I'm running through this very quickly, I apologize. Included sort of a cumulative effect in terms of saved lives over the time frame, and then shows some shift in the population in terms of where jobs go and people go as a result of where energy prices are and where the jobs actually are as a result of where this type of production might occur. So I think I went through that very quickly, but I want to make sure we do open this up for some questions. As I said, we want to continue to be a resource. What we're going to try to do is answer what we can now, and then provide maybe some written responses as well for things that we can't cover, and continue to develop the sort of existing FAQ. But thank you, and I'll open it up to the man at the mic.